All four of you come in. Boone Carter had heard a lot of strange things in his 32 years, but he'd never heard words like that, not spoken in perfect, clear English, not from a woman who had no business being there, and definitely not from inside a cabin that was supposed to be empty. A cabin that had been rotting for 3 long winters, a place everyone knew was haunted by fever and death. He sat dead still on his horse, just watching. A thin ribbon of smoke curled up from the chimney, lazy and gray against the blue sky. But that smoke was all wrong. Everything here was wrong. The Miller family had died in this cabin, every last one of them. The place was a tomb, but someone had swept the porch clean. Someone had fixed the broken shutter that used to bang in the wind. And someone, right now, was cooking a meal over a fire inside. The voice came again, closer this time, and there was no mistaking it. It was a woman. "You can come closer. They won't run if you move slowly." She was talking about the children. Boone squinted. He could just make them out. 3 little shapes hiding behind a messy pile of firewood. They were small, child-sized for sure. He could see their dirty faces peeking out, their eyes wide and old. Far too old for kids. Why were they hiding from him? And who was this woman who sounded so calm, like a stranger riding up on her doorstep was the most normal thing in the world? But the real question, the one that made the hair on his neck stand up, was how? How did she know he was even there? He hadn't made a single sound. His horse, Bess, knew how to walk on soft earth without snapping a twig. He'd come in from downwind, a trick his father had taught him, a habit that had kept him breathing all these years. He was a ghost in these woods. Unless she wasn't surprised to see him, unless she was expecting him. The cabin door creaked open, just a crack at first, then wider. And what Boone Carter saw made his blood turn to ice in his veins. It wasn't who was standing there that scared him. It was what it all meant. She was an Apache woman. Her hair was long and black, braided down her back, and woven into those braids were thin strips of leather. Leather he recognized. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that leather. It was from a dress that belonged to Sarah Whitman, the Whitman family. They'd vanished 2 months back. Just gone. Left behind a cold breakfast on the table, a spooked horse in the corral, and a reward poster that was now faded and peeling on the wall of the general store. The Apache woman looked right at him. Her eyes didn't hold any surprise. They didn't hold any fear. They just held a deep, terrible sadness, a knowing that seemed to stretch back for 1,000 years. "I've been waiting for you, Boone Carter," she said. He'd never laid eyes on her in his entire life. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent, "before they come looking." Boone's hand went for his gun. It was pure instinct, a reflex carved into him by years of riding through dangerous country. But he stopped. The woman hadn't moved. She just stood there, her hands open at her sides where he could see them. She wasn't a threat. In fact, she looked relieved, like a weight was finally being lifted off her shoulders. "How do you know my name?" His voice was a raw croak. "Word travels fast," she said simply. "A good man asks a lot of questions about a missing family. People notice." She stepped back from the door, opening it wider. He could see inside now. The cabin was spotless. A small fire crackled in the hearth, and a pot of something that smelled like stew was bubbling over the flames. "The children are hungry," she said, her eyes flicking toward the woodpile. "They've been hiding since sunrise." Boone looked back at the kids. The oldest was a boy, maybe 8. He had his arms out, trying to shield the 2 smaller ones behind him. They were all wearing clothes that were little more than rags, patched and repatched until you couldn't tell the original color. But the clothes were clean. "Whose children are they?" he asked, though he was starting to get a sick feeling in his gut that he already knew the answer. "That," she said, her dark eyes locking onto his, "is what we need to discuss, but not out here." She glanced nervously toward the main trail. "Sheriff Morrison's men have been riding this way every day. They'll be back before the sun goes down." Morrison. The name was like a snake bite. Sheriff James Morrison. The man had made a career out of clearing Apache families from their land. If he found this woman here, in an abandoned cabin, with 3 white children, "You're putting them in danger just by being here," Boone said, his voice hard. I'm keeping them alive by being here, she shot back, a fire flashing in her eyes. Those children you see? Their names are Tommy, Lily, and Samuel. They've been with me for 6 weeks. Before that, they were alone, starving, in the ashes of their own home. The pieces started to fall into place, forming a picture so ugly Boone didn't want to look at it. A burned homestead, a missing family, and 3 children left for dead. But it didn't make sense. The Whitman place burned down 2 months ago, he said, thinking out loud. Morrison's official report said there were no survivors. Morrison's report was a lie. She took a step closer to him, and he could see the leather strips in her hair plain as day now. They were from Sarah Whitman's Sunday dress, the one with the little blue flowers embroidered on the collar. But she wasn't wearing them like trophies. They were woven into her hair like mourning bands, a sign of respect. He was wrong about a lot of things, she said softly. From behind the woodpile, the boy, Tommy, whispered something to his little brother and sister. They looked terrified, but they weren't looking at Boone. Their eyes kept darting back toward the road, back in the direction that Morrison's men would be coming from. Why me? Boone asked, turning back to the woman. Why were you waiting for me? She was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching out between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with secrets she'd carried for too long. Because you're the only one, she said. The only one who came back to the Whitman grave after the funeral. The only one who left flowers. The only one who might actually care what really happened to their children. Suddenly a sound cut through the quiet. Hoofbeats. They all froze. It was more than one horse. Still a ways off, but coming closer. Coming at a steady, determined pace. The woman's face went white. They're early, she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. They're never this early. She looked at Boone, her gaze so intense it felt like he was being branded. Boone Carter, she said, her voice trembling just a little. In the next 5 minutes, you're going to have to decide. You're going to have to decide what kind of man you really are. The hoofbeats were louder now, unmistakably louder. Boone could count them. At least 3 horses, maybe 4. They were moving along the main trail, pushing their animals hard. They'd be at the cabin in minutes. Get the children inside, he said, his voice low and calm. Now. The Apache woman gave a sharp, soft whistle. It wasn't a command, it was a signal. Instantly, the 3 kids scrambled out from behind the woodpile and darted for the cabin door. The boy, Tommy, grabbed his sister's hand and his little brother's arm, pulling them along. He moved with a kind of practiced urgency, like he'd done this 100 times before. Wait! Boone held up a hand just as they reached the doorway. He knelt down looking at the youngest, Samuel. The little boy stared back, his blue eyes huge in his small, grimy face. He was scared, but there was something else in his eyes too, a flicker of curiosity. You're the Whitman children, Boone said. It wasn't a question anymore. Now that he saw them up close, there was no doubt. Tommy had his father's square jaw. Lily had her mother's soft eyes. And little Samuel had the same tiny cleft in his chin that Jonathan Whitman had. Their parents died trying to save them, the woman said from the doorway. I found them 3 days after the fire. Tommy, he was feeding his brother and sister soup he'd made from tree bark, just trying to keep them alive. The sound of the horses was getting closer. They were almost here. In that moment, Boone Carter made a choice that would change his life and theirs forever. My name's Boone Carter, he said to Tommy, keeping his voice gentle. He was still crouched down, trying to make himself look less threatening. Your father, Jonathan, and I, we traded horses a few times. He was a good man. You look just like him. Tommy's eyes, so serious and old just a second ago, widened, a flicker of memory, and then they filled with tears. Tears the boy had probably been holding back for 6 long weeks. Can you take us home? Lily whispered. Her voice was so small he could barely hear it. Boone's throat felt like it was full of sand. There was no home. Their home was a pile of black timbers and cold ash. Before he could figure out what to say, the Apache woman put a hand on his shoulder. Her name is Ayana, Tommy said, his voice suddenly clear. He pointed at the woman. She saved us. She's been taking care of us. But people keep trying to hurt her. Ayana. It meant eternal blossom in her language. Boone knew a little of the Apache tongue, enough to know that was her real name, not some fake name she'd give to the law. She trusted these children. The hoofbeats stopped, right outside the cabin. He heard the jingle of spurs as men swung down from their saddles. 3 of them. Stay calm, Ayana whispered to the children. Remember what we practiced. Practiced? What in God's name had they been practicing for? A heavy fist hammered on the door, making the whole cabin shake. Open up! Sheriff's business! Boone knew that voice. Deputy Frank Miller, Morrison's right-hand man and his biggest bully. Miller was a man who preferred to ask questions with his knuckles, a man who saw every Apache as a target. Ayana looked at Boone, her eyes pleading. Please, she mouthed. They're just children. Another crash against the door. We know you're in there. Open this door or we're kicking it down. Tommy, all of 8 years old, stepped in front of his brother and sister. A small, fierce protector, already carrying the weight of the world on his tiny shoulders. Boone stood up. He walked toward the door. His hand was resting on the butt of his Colt, but he was praying he wouldn't have to use it. He had maybe 2 seconds to figure out how to play this. Just as he reached for the old iron latch, Ayana grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. There's something else, she whispered, her words coming in a rush. It's about why the Whitmans really died, and why Sheriff Morrison can't afford for anyone to find these children alive. The door shuttered again under a third thunderous blow. Boone put a finger to his lips, signaling Ayana and the children to be absolutely silent. He took a deep breath. Then he turned the handle, pulled the door open, and stepped outside, pulling it shut tight behind him. Deputy Frank Miller was standing there, his face red and sweaty. He had 2 other deputies with him, both of them wearing the same cheap tin stars that Morrison handed out to any thug willing to do his bidding. Miller looked angry, but underneath the anger, Boone saw something else. He saw fear. Afternoon, Frank, Boone said, his voice easy and calm. What brings you boys all the way out here? Cut the games, Carter, Miller snarled. We saw smoke coming from this cabin. Someone's been squatting here, and we're going to find out who. Place looks empty to me, Boone said. He kept his tone level, but he didn't move his hand from his gun. Maybe you boys saw my campfire. I was just resting my horse. Miller tried to push past him, heading for the door. Step aside. We're searching the place. Boone shifted his weight, blocking the way. On whose authority? On Sheriff Morrison's authority, Miller spat. We got reports of Apache raiders hitting settlements in the area, stealing food. That was a flat-out lie, and both of them knew it. The only people going hungry around here were the Apache families that Morrison had been systematically running off their own hunting grounds. Funny, Boone said, letting a little smile play on his lips. I heard the food shortages only started after Morrison and his boys started burning the Apache's winter stores. Kind of hard for folks to feed their kids when you burn all their food. Miller's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. You taking sides with savages now, Carter? The word savages hit Boone like a punch to the gut. Inside the cabin, he heard a tiny sound, the sound of a little girl whimpering. It had to be Lily. Tommy was probably in there right now, his hand over her mouth, trying to keep her quiet. I'm taking sides with children, Boone said, his voice dropping low. Children who need protecting. What children? Miller took a step closer, his own voice sinking to a threatening whisper. You know something about them Whitman kids? And there it was. The question confirmed everything. Morrison wasn't just on some random patrol for Apache raiders. He was actively hunting for the Whitman children. Why would Morrison care about a couple of dead kids? Boone asked, choosing his words carefully. Miller's face went pale. He'd said too much. He'd given the game away. Because they ain't dead, one of the other deputies, a young fool named Peters, blurted out. Morrison says they could identify. Shut up, Peters, Miller snapped, turning on his man. But it was too late. The truth was out there now, hanging in the air between them. The Whitman children were alive, and they had seen something Sheriff Morrison would kill to keep buried. Inside the cabin, Boone heard a floorboard creak. Then he heard Ayana's voice, a desperate whisper through the thick wood of the door. Tommy, no! The cabin door swung open, and Tommy Whitman stepped out into the sunlight. The 8-year-old boy looked up at the three armed men. His small face was set like stone. His eyes held no fear, only a cold, hard determination that no child should ever have. "My name is Thomas James Whitman," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "My pa was Jonathan Whitman. My ma was Sarah Whitman, and I saw the man who killed them." Miller's hand flew to his gun. "The night our house burned," Tommy went on, his voice never wavering, "it wasn't Apache raiders who came. It was Sheriff Morrison, him and 5 of his men. They made us watch. They made us watch while they shot my parents. Then they set our house on fire and they left us in there to die." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the buzz of a fly a dozen yards away. Miller's gun was halfway out of its holster. Before it could clear the leather, Boone's hand shot out and clamped down on the deputy's wrist like a steel trap. "I wouldn't do that, Frank," Boone said, his voice dangerously soft. But Tommy wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "They were looking for something," the boy said. "Papers. Papers my pa kept hidden in a box under the floor. They found the box, but they didn't know we were watching. They didn't know we saw everything from the root cellar." Miller ripped his hand out of Boone's grasp. His face was a twisted mask of pure panic and rage. "You lying little—" "Frank," Boone's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "You draw that gun, and you'll answer to me." The deputy froze. Boone Carter wasn't a man who made idle threats. He had a reputation, one that even Morrison's hired thugs had to respect. But Miller was a cornered animal now, and that made him reckless. "The boy's talking crazy," he stammered. "The Apache woman, she must have filled his head with lies." "No lies," Tommy said, his small voice firm as a rock. I remember. I remember everything. Sheriff Morrison shot my pa. Then he shot my ma when she tried to run to him. He told his men to smash things up, to make it look like an Apache raid. But I heard him. I heard him talking about land deeds. Talking about some man named Fletcher, who was buying up all the territory for cheap. Miller's face went from red to the color of chalk. The name Fletcher had landed like a hammer blow. Peters, the deputy who couldn't keep his mouth shut, started backing away slowly. "Frank, maybe we should just go. Maybe we should—" "We finish what the sheriff started," Miller snarled. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting back and forth. He was doing the math. 3 of them, all armed, against 1 cowboy, an Apache woman, and 3 small children. To him, the odds looked good. Behind Tommy, the cabin door opened wider. Ayanna stepped out. Her hands were empty, held out where Miller could see them, but her eyes were burning with a fire so hot it could have melted steel. Behind her, Lily and Samuel were clinging to her legs, their faces buried in her dress. "These children have been through enough," Ayanna said, her voice quiet but ringing with power. "Haven't you taken enough from them already?" "Shut your mouth, squaw," Miller spat. "You're all coming with us. The sheriff will figure out what to do with you." And that's when Boone Carter made the choice that would define the rest of his days. "No," he said. It was just one word spoken softly, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "They're not going anywhere." Miller let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "You think you can stop us, Carter? You against the 3 of us? You ain't that good." "Maybe not," Boone said. His hand was hanging loose and easy by his side, but he'd shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet. He was perfectly balanced, ready to move. "But I don't have to be good, Frank. I just have to be faster than you." The silence stretched out, pulled tight like a rope about to snap. Boone could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. He could smell the sour sweat of fear coming off Miller and his men. These weren't real gunfighters. They were just bullies, used to pushing around unarmed farmers and scaring helpless families. "Besides," Boone said, his voice almost conversational now, like they were discussing the weather, "you boys seem to have forgotten one very important thing." "What's that?" Miller demanded, his eyes twitching. "I'm not the only one listening to this conversation." Miller's eyes widened. For the first time he heard it too. The sound that Boone had noticed a full minute ago. More horses. They were coming from the opposite direction, up the trail from town. But these riders weren't in a hurry. They weren't riding with the aggressive, angry pace of Morrison's men. These riders were taking their time, probably just heading home after a day of business. Sounds like the Henderson brothers, Boone observed casually. Jake and Moses. Good. Church-going men. The Hendersons. I bet they'd be real interested to hear the story of how our good Sheriff Morrison has been murdering his neighbors for land deeds. Peters didn't need to hear any more. He was already stumbling backward toward his horse. Frank, we gotta go. Right now. Miller's hand twitched one last time, his fingers hovering over the butt of his pistol. But the hoofbeats were getting closer. If Boone was right, if it really was the Hendersons, Miller couldn't afford any witnesses. Not for what he'd been about to do. This ain't over, Carter, he growled, backing away. Oh, yes, it is, Boone replied, his voice calm and steady as the mountains. From this moment on, these children are under my protection, and anyone who wants to hurt them is going to have to come through me first. As Miller and his two deputies scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of panic dust, Boone turned to face the small group huddled behind him. Tommy was standing a little taller now, his young shoulders squared with a fresh, fragile hope. Lily had stopped crying, and little Samuel was looking up at the tall cowboy with an expression of pure awe. Ayanna watched him, her dark eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Gratitude was in there, but so was something else, something deeper. You just made enemies of some very dangerous men, she said softly. I've had worse, Boone replied. He looked down at the three children who had lost everything. He looked at the brave woman who had saved them, and he made them an offer that would change all of their lives. All four of you, he said, his voice quiet but firm, his gaze taking in Ayanna as well as the children. Come inside. Just as Miller's dust settled, two riders crested the hill. It was Jake and Moses Henderson, just like Boone had guessed. They were honest men, ranchers who worked hard and kept to themselves. But Boone knew that what he was about to tell them would test the limits of their quiet lives. Having some trouble, Boone? Jake called out, reining in his horse. His eyes swept over the scene, taking it all in. The Apache woman, the three white children who looked like they'd been through a war, and Boone himself, standing there like a guard dog at the gates of hell. Depends on how you look at it, Boone answered carefully. Moses Henderson swung down from his saddle. The first thing he did was take off his hat. It was a gesture of respect toward Ayanna. Good manners ran deep in the Henderson family. They didn't care what color a person's skin was. Ma'am, he said, giving her a small, polite nod. These are the Whitman children, Boone said, deciding there was no point in beating around the bush. Tommy, Lily, and Samuel. Turns out they've been alive this whole time. The two brothers stared, their mouths hanging open. They'd been at the funeral. They'd shoveled dirt onto the three empty coffins. They'd mourned with the whole town for the loss of the entire family. That's impossible, Jake stammered. Morrison told us himself. No survivors. We searched the ruins. Morrison lied, Tommy said. His voice was small, but it cut through the air with the shocking force of truth. He killed my parents. I saw him. The accusation landed like a punch. Moses knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. He looked deep into Tommy's eyes, searching for any hint of a lie. Son, he said gently, that's a mighty serious thing to say about a man. It's the truth, Tommy insisted, his voice not wavering for a second. He shot my pa first. Then he shot my ma. Then he set our house on fire and left us to die in the root cellar. Ayanna rested a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. I found them 3 days later, she explained. They were half-starved and terrified, but they were alive. Jake Henderson looked deeply troubled. But why? Why would Morrison want to kill Jonathan Whitman? They were neighbors. They sat in the same pew at church every Sunday. Because of what my pa found, Tommy said. He found papers. Papers hidden in our cellar. They were about a man named Fletcher who was buying up all the land for cheap after families got scared off by Apache raids. But the raids, they were fake. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in Moses's mind. Fletcher, he said, his eyes widening, that's Morrison's cousin. The rich one from back east. He's bought up nearly half the valley in the last year. He's been buying it cheap because Morrison has been staging fake raids, terrorizing families into selling for pennies on the dollar, Boone added, filling in the gaps. And when Jonathan Whitman found the proof, Jake finished, his voice grim, Morrison had to shut him up, him and his entire family. Little Samuel, who had been silent and clinging to Ayanna's leg this whole time, suddenly spoke. His voice was a tiny, heartbreaking whisper. "The man with the star," he said. "He shot Mama while she was praying." Those simple, devastating words coming from a 4-year-old boy carried more weight than anything the adults had said. They were the pure, unvarnished truth. Moses stood up slowly. His face looked like it had been carved from granite. "What do you need from us, Boone?" he asked. "Safe passage," Boone said immediately. "We need to get to Fort Randall. Colonel Hayes needs to hear this story. Morrison has been operating under federal authority, claiming he's just clearing out Apache settlements. But if Hayes finds out he's been murdering white families to steal their land, Morrison will never let you get that far," Jake warned. "He'll have his men watching every main road between here and the fort." "Then we don't take the main roads," Ayanna said, speaking for the first time. She looked up at Boone, a question in her eyes. "We," Boone confirmed, looking from her to the children. "All 4 of you are my responsibility now. I meant what I said." The weight of that promise settled over them. Boone Carter, the man who had ridden alone for 15 years, the man who avoided attachments like the plague, had just pledged his life to protect an Apache woman and 3 orphans from a corrupt sheriff who had an army of killers at his command. "There's something else," Moses said quietly, his face dark with worry. "Morrison isn't just worried about the testimony. The word in town is that Fletcher himself is coming next week. He's coming to finalize the biggest land purchase of all." Jake's eyes went wide with horror. "The entire Henderson Valley," he breathed. "Our land. Everyone's land. Every family that's been scared into selling cheap." Tommy looked up at Boone, his eyes shining with a desperate, terrifying hope. "Can you really stop them?" he asked. "Can you stop the bad men?" Before Boone could answer, Lily tugged on Ayanna's dress. She pointed a small, trembling finger toward the horizon. "More riders," she whispered. "More riders are coming." This time, there were more than just a few. It looked like at least 6 horses, and they weren't taking their time. They were coming fast. But these weren't Morrison's men. Boone recognized the horse in the lead long before he could make out the rider. It was a beautiful paint mare, a distinctive horse that belonged to only one man in this territory, Colonel Hayes. "That's the military," Moses said, a wave of relief washing over his face. "Those are cavalry uniforms." But Boone's relief was a flicker, gone as fast as it came. If Colonel Hayes was riding out here himself, in person, it could only mean one thing. Morrison had gotten to him first. The column of soldiers pulled up about 50 yards away. Colonel Hayes rode forward alone. He was a hard man, his face weathered by years of sun and war. Behind him, 5 cavalry troopers sat ramrod straight in their saddles, their hands resting on their carbines. "Mr. Carter," Hayes said. His voice was formal, cold as a winter morning. "Colonel," Boone said, stepping forward. He made sure to position himself between the soldiers and the children. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." "Sheriff Morrison rode into Fort Randall about an hour ago," Hayes said, his eyes hard as stone. "He came with some very disturbing reports. He claims you've assaulted his deputies. He claims you're harboring an Apache woman wanted for questioning in a series of raids. And he claims you've kidnapped 3 children." Tommy started to say something, but Ayanna put a gentle hand on his arm, silencing him. She was smart. She knew that in a world run by white men, a child's word meant nothing against an official report from a sheriff. "That's not what happened here, Colonel," Jake Henderson said, stepping up beside Boone. "These here are the Whitman children. We can vouch for them." Hayes looked at the 3 kids, studying their faces. "That's impossible, Mr. Henderson. Sheriff Morrison showed me their official death certificates, signed by Dr. Patterson himself." "Patterson was paid off," Moses said, his voice ringing with anger. "Just like every other official in this territory, Morrison couldn't buy." "That's a very serious accusation," Hayes said, his voice still cold. "It's a very serious situation. Boone shot back, his own voice calm but firm. Colonel, these children watched James Morrison murder their parents in cold blood. They've been hiding in fear for their lives for 6 weeks because they know he'll kill them to keep them quiet. Hayes swung down from his horse. He walked slowly toward Tommy. The boy didn't flinch. He stood his ground, meeting the colonel's gaze with a bravery that was simply astonishing. He was an 8-year-old boy who had seen his entire world burn down, and he was still standing. Son, Hayes said, his voice a little softer now. Do you know who I am? You're Colonel Hayes, Tommy said. My pa said you were an honest man. Your father was a good judge of character, Hayes replied. Now I want you to tell me. Tell me everything you saw the night your family died. Tommy took a deep breath, and then he told the story. For the third time, he told it all again. But this time, he remembered more details. The names of the deputies Morrison had with him. The specific words Morrison used when he talked about the land deal with Fletcher. The way the sheriff had laughed after he'd set the house on fire. As Tommy spoke, Colonel Hayes's face grew darker and darker. When the boy finally finished, the colonel was silent for a long, heavy moment. These are federal crimes, he said at last, his voice a low growl. Murder, conspiracy to defraud the United States government. If what this boy says is true, then Sheriff Morrison has been running a criminal empire right under my nose, using his badge as a shield. It's true, Lily said suddenly. Her small voice was like a tiny bell, cutting through all the deep, angry voices of the men. The bad man shot Mama. And then he laughed. The simple, horrible testimony of a 6-year-old girl seemed to shake Colonel Hayes more than anything else. He turned to Ayanna. Ma'am, he said, and for the first time, there was real respect in his voice. How did you come to be involved in this? I heard them crying, she said simply. They were trapped in the root cellar. I dug them out, and I've been protecting them ever since. At considerable risk to yourself, Hayes observed. Ayanna looked at the 3 children huddled around her. Children are worth any risk, she said. Hayes nodded, a look of deep approval on his face. Then he turned back to Boone, and his expression was a mixture of respect and serious concern. Mr. Carter, he said, Sheriff Morrison has officially issued a warrant for your arrest. He's claiming you're a fugitive from justice. He has also requested federal authority to organize a manhunt to bring you in. The news felt like a rope tightening around Boone's neck. When? He's gathering men right now, Hayes said grimly. By nightfall, there will be 20 armed riders scouring every inch of this territory with orders to shoot you on sight. Little Samuel, who had been clutching Ayanna's hand this whole time, finally spoke up. Are the bad men going to hurt us again? He asked, his voice trembling. The question hung in the air, a heartbreaking challenge to every man standing there. Boone looked down at the terrified child. He looked at Lily and Tommy. He looked at Ayanna, the woman who had risked everything for them. No, he said, his voice hard as iron. They're not. Hayes studied Boone's face, his eyes searching. What are you planning, Carter? Whatever it takes, Boone said. Whatever it takes to get these children to safety. That could mean starting a war with Morrison and every man he's hired, Hayes warned. Boone's hand drifted down, resting on the butt of his gun. Then that's what it means. But then Colonel Hayes did something completely unexpected. A small, grim smile touched his lips. It might not come to that, he said. You see, Morrison made one very big mistake when he came to my office today. What was that? Boone asked. He assumed I was just as crooked as he is, Hayes said, the smile growing wider. He offered me a piece of the action, a 10% cut of all of Fletcher's profits from the land deal, if I would help him hunt down and eliminate the witnesses. The meaning of his words hit Boone like a lightning strike. You have evidence, he breathed. You have proof of the conspiracy. I have Sheriff Morrison's own words, Hayes confirmed, witnessed by my adjutant. It's enough to hang him, enough to arrest him for treason. He paused, letting the good news sink in. Then he delivered the words that changed everything. But first, he said, his eyes softening as he looked at the children, I need to get these kids somewhere safe, somewhere Morrison and his kind can never, ever reach them. Where? Ayanna asked, her voice barely a whisper. Colonel Hayes looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a respect and admiration that no one had probably shown her in her entire life. My wife and I, he said slowly, we've been hoping to start a family for years. We have a big house at the fort. There's a good school. And there's the United States Army to stand guard. We can protect them. The offer was so generous, so far beyond anything they could have hoped for, that for a moment no one could speak. But that moment was shattered by a sharp cry from one of the cavalry troopers. "Colonel, riders approaching from the south. Fast!" Boone looked. On the southern ridge, a line of horsemen had appeared. There were at least 15 of them, a small army. Morrison had found them, and this time he wasn't sending his deputies. He was coming himself. Morrison's men fanned out, forming a wide, menacing half-circle around the small cabin. Every man had his rifle out, ready for a fight. The corrupt sheriff sat his horse in the center of the line, his face a purple mask of pure rage. And right beside him, looking pale and out of place in his expensive Eastern suit, was his cousin, Fletcher. "Colonel Hayes," Morrison shouted, his voice dripping with false respect. "I'm surprised to find an officer of the U.S. Army harboring fugitives and kidnappers." Hayes urged his horse forward, his back straight, his military bearing a stark contrast to Morrison's ragged posse. "The only criminal I see here is you, Sheriff," Hayes said, his voice booming across the clearing. "Or I should say, former sheriff." "What's that supposed to mean?" Morrison snarled. Hayes reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "As of this moment, by order of the territorial governor and the authority of the United States government, you are relieved of your duties. James Morrison, you are under federal arrest for conspiracy, murder, and high treason." Morrison's face went from purple to dead white. "You can't do this. I have authority in this county." "You had authority," Hayes corrected him sharply. "Authority you used to murder innocent families so your cousin here could steal their land." "Yes, Fletcher, I know all about you too." Fletcher tried to puff out his chest and look important, but a line of sweat was trickling down his temple. "Colonel, I assure you there has been a grave misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Boone cut in, his voice like cold steel, "was you thinking you could get away with it." Tommy stepped forward. Ayanna tried to hold him back, but he gently pulled away from her. The 8-year-old boy walked out into the open space between the two groups of armed men. He stopped and looked straight up at the man who had destroyed his life. "I remember your voice," Tommy said, his voice clear and unwavering. "You told your men to make it look like an Apache raid. But you're the one. You shot my pa yourself while he was trying to protect my ma." "You lying little brat!" Morrison started to scream, but Hayes cut him off. "The boy's testimony perfectly corroborates the evidence I have already gathered," the colonel announced loudly for all the hired guns to hear, "including your personal offer to cut me in on the profits if I helped you murder these children." That sent a shockwave through Morrison's men. They had signed on to hunt an Apache and a kidnapper, not to be part of a federal treason case. They started looking at each other, their confidence wavering. "Boys!" Jake Henderson shouted from beside Boone. "You might want to think hard about who you're really working for. Morrison's been using you to run his neighbors off their own land. It was the Whitmans today, but it could be your family next." That hit home. Several of Morrison's men exchanged nervous glances. Moses Henderson was right. If the sheriff could murder one of the most respected families in the territory just for a piece of paper, then none of them were safe. "Don't listen to them!" Morrison shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. "They're trying to turn you against the law." But his authority was dissolving like sugar in the rain. 3 of his men slowly, deliberately, put their rifles back in their saddle scabbards and started to back their horses away. Fletcher saw which way the wind was blowing. He tried to save his own skin. "Sheriff Morrison was acting entirely without my knowledge or consent," he declared. "I had no idea about any of this." "Shut your mouth, you coward," Morrison snapped. "You think throwing me to the wolves is going to save you now?" The sheer panic in Morrison's voice told everyone the truth. Fletcher's face turned to ash as he realized his cousin was about to drag him down with him. Colonel Hayes raised his hand, seizing the moment. His voice rang out with absolute authority. "All men loyal to the law of the United States, step aside now. Anyone who continues to stand with this traitor will be considered an enemy of the state and will face a federal tribunal." That was all it took. The rest of the hired guns didn't hesitate. Within seconds, they had all pulled back, leaving Morrison and Fletcher completely alone, with only their two most loyal and most stupid deputies by their side. It was over. "Surrender now, Morrison," Boone said quietly. "Maybe you'll live long enough to see a trial." Morrison's hand twitched, hovering over his gun. But he looked at Boone, at the cold promise in the cowboy's eyes. He looked at Colonel Hayes and his 5 troopers, all of whom now had their carbines leveled directly at his chest. "You think you've won?" Morrison snarled, his voice a pathetic rasp. "Even if you arrest me, Fletcher has enough money to buy every judge in this territory." "Not every judge," Colonel Hayes said with a grim smile. "Federal judges answer to Washington Morrison, not to your cousin's wallet." The trap had closed. There was no way out. Morrison's desperate eyes swept across the faces of the people who had brought his empire crashing down. The cowboy, the Apache woman, and the 3 small children who had found the courage to speak the truth. "This isn't finished," he growled, but there was no conviction in his voice, only the bitter taste of defeat. Then a small, innocent voice piped up from behind Ayanna. It was Samuel. "Bad man can't hurt us anymore?" The simple question from a 4-year-old boy who had lost everything seemed to suck the last bit of fight out of the air. Even some of Morrison's former men, watching from a distance, looked down at the ground in shame. "No, little one," Ayanna said softly, pulling Samuel into her arms and holding him tight. "The bad man can't hurt us anymore." But Morrison was a cornered rat, and a cornered rat will always make one last, desperate lunge. His hand dropped to his gun. It was a fool's move, a last, suicidal act of defiance. But before his fingers could even touch the handle, Boone's Colt was out, cocked, and aimed steady as a rock right at Morrison's heart. "Don't," Boone said. It was just one word. The sheer speed of the draw left Morrison frozen in place, his hand hovering uselessly in the air. Around him, the cavalry soldiers' rifles were all trained on him and his last 2 men. "James Morrison," Colonel Hayes announced in a loud, formal voice, "you are under arrest. Surrender your weapons, immediately." There was no choice. Morrison slowly, reluctantly, raised his hands in the air. His 2 deputies practically threw their guns on the ground, their faces flooded with relief that the nightmare was finally over. Fletcher made one last, pathetic attempt to save himself. "Colonel, I am willing to cooperate fully with your investigation. I can provide all the evidence you need against my cousin." "You can provide your evidence from a federal prison cell," Hayes cut him off coldly. "You're just as guilty as he is." The soldiers moved in, clapping irons on the wrists of Morrison, Fletcher, and the 2 remaining deputies. As they were being led away, Tommy walked right up to the man who had murdered his parents. The 8-year-old boy looked up at the defeated, broken sheriff. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a quiet, solemn justice. "My pa always told me that a man's bad choices always catch up to him in the end," Tommy said, his voice soft but clear. He was right. Morrison just stared down at the small boy he had tried so hard to silence. And maybe, just for a second, he finally saw the true cost of his greed. But it was far, far too late for regrets. 2 hours later, Morrison and Fletcher were locked in the back of a military wagon, on their way to Fort Randall to face a federal judge. Their hired guns were long gone, scattered to the 4 winds. And the Henderson brothers were riding through the valley, spreading the news that it was safe for families to come back to their homes. Boone stood outside the little cabin, watching as Ayanna helped the children gather their few meager belongings. Colonel Hayes had made his offer official. All 4 of them were invited to come live at the fort. "You did a good thing today, Carter," Hayes said, walking up beside him. "Those children would be dead if it weren't for you." "They saved themselves," Boone said. "All I did was give them the chance to tell their story." "My wife is going to spoil them rotten," Hayes said with a smile. "She's already picking out rooms and looking into school books. That boy Tommy, he's sharp as a tack. And the little ones will blossom with some real care." Boone just nodded. He was surprised to feel a tightness in his own throat. He'd spent 15 years riding alone, telling himself it was better that way. But the thought of saying goodbye to this strange little family, it was harder than he ever would have imagined. "What about Ayanna?" he asked. There are some folks who won't take kindly to her, an Apache woman raising white children. Some folks are idiots, Hayes said bluntly. My wife doesn't see an Apache woman. She sees a hero who risked her own life to save 3 orphans. That's the only kind of person we want in our family. Just then, Tommy came to the doorway. He was holding a small, lumpy bundle tied up in a piece of cloth. Mr. Boone? He asked, his voice full of hope. Are you coming with us? The question hung there in the quiet afternoon air. Boone had spent his whole adult life running from attachments, convinced that being alone was the only way to stay safe. But as he looked at Tommy's hopeful face, at Lily peeking out from behind Ayanna's skirt, at little Samuel who had started calling him Papa Boone, he realized that his old life, the life of a lonely rider, suddenly felt terribly empty. Well, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, if Colonel Hayes doesn't mind one more mouth to feed. Hayes let out a booming laugh. Son, I think we can manage. Ayanna came out of the cabin then, holding Lily's hand and carrying Samuel on her hip. Her dark eyes met Boone's across the small yard. He saw gratitude in them and respect. But he saw something else too. The beginning of a partnership. The foundation of a new life, built not on blood, but on courage and shared purpose. Ready? She asked him. Boone took one last look around, at the small, abandoned cabin where his entire world had changed, where a simple choice to protect the innocent had grown into something so much bigger. A family, a real family. All 4 of us, he said, echoing the words that had started this whole journey, we're ready. As they rode toward Fort Randall, a strange and wonderful new caravan, Tommy chattered excitedly about what it would be like to go to a real school. Lily hummed a little song to herself, and Samuel fell fast asleep, his small head resting against Boone's chest. Ayanna rode right beside him, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She was looking ahead, toward a future where she was safe, and where the children she had saved would grow up loved and protected. Behind them, the little cabin in the woods grew smaller and smaller, until it was just a speck in the distance. Ahead of them lay Fort Randall, a new home, and a woman waiting with open arms to welcome her new family. Boone Carter had spent 15 years running from his past. Now, for the first time, he was riding toward his future. The cowboy who thought he was destined to ride alone had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in solitude. It's found when you choose to ride together. If you enjoyed this story, then click the video you see on your screen right now for another tale of justice and unexpected heroes in the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Your support is what keeps these stories alive.